it arose naturally and organically. It became something that I could do and enjoy as a creative act rather than just something I was thinking of as, oh, my marketing duty. I mean, marketing can be fun if you can find the ways to do it that are true to you. And in my case, telling a story or telling the ongoing story of something that's been going on for a long time, but also finding something like an abandoned airfield and thinking, right, how am I going to make this interesting to a lot of people? And again, that's a nice creative challenge too.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Roz Morris about newsletter marketing as a creative endeavor, including how authors can creatively integrate personal stories and ongoing projects into newsletters to engage readers. Roz shares her journey of finding the right content for her newsletter, emphasizing the importance of marketing the author alongside the books. She provides insights into using personal adventures and research anecdotes to connect with the audience. And we also discuss the benefits of interactivity, the role of social media groups, and maintaining a consistent creative output that resonates with readers. And a quick request before we get to the interview. If you've gotten value from the podcast, please drop by my Facebook page at The Indie Author, and that's Indie with a Y, and say, hey, it's a fun place to continue conversations about a guest's topic. And now let's hear from Roz Morris about newsletter marketing as a creative endeavor. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Roz Morris. Hey, Roz, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. Very well. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Roz Morris's novels and memoir have been recognized by major mainstream awards. She's coached award-winning writers in both fiction and nonfiction, taught creative writing for the Guardian Masterclasses, blogged for Writers and Artists Yearbook, and has been a regular judge on Litopia's pop-up submission show, critiquing manuscripts from promising writers. And the reason I'm interested in talking with Roz today is I think that oftentimes writers think of their creative work and their marketing work as two separate things. Like, I'm being creative with my writing, and now I'm going to go and do marketing, and that's somehow like a whole different mindset. And Roz has what I think is a great example of how that doesn't have to be the case, and that is her newsletter. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how Roz is applying her creative work to all her aspects of her writing and publishing life, using the newsletter as an example. But Roz, I thought it would be useful just to hear a little bit about, well, let's start out with what its goal is, and then we can start diving in a little bit to the content you are creating in order to support that goal.
Well, for a long time, I didn't know what to put in my newsletter because I've been around the indie author world since 2009. And one of the first people I came across was Joanna Penn, and she was saying, and she's a friend of mine, and she said to me, you've got to start a newsletter. And I was thinking, well, what will I put in it? Because I write books quite slowly. And everyone else I knew in the indie world was putting them out quite fast. And they were doing at least a book a year, sometimes 2 books a year. They were also writing in quite recognized genres. And there were already templates for what people would put in their author newsletters. It would be, I am reading these sorts of books, which are exactly like the books I'm writing, and it's like they're like the books that you all enjoy. So they knew to talk about the right kind of books. They knew to talk about the research they were doing in the next creepy place they were setting a book in, and the kinds of historical figures who were inspiring them, and all that. And it was very well defined what they would talk about in their newsletter. Whereas I don't tend to write books like that. I don't write them fast. My last novel took 7 years. In between, I did actually publish a few other books as well. There were writing craft books, and there was also a travel memoir. And my main kind of work, though, is not that easy to talk about repeatedly because it's very slow. The news I would have each month about my book would be written a bit more. Please be patient. And that's boring, and you're not going to be giving anybody anything to come back to. And then I had an inspiration for a book that sort of changed everything, really. It happened that at the end of 2016, I got out a travel diary that I've been keeping for years and years. Every time we go somewhere, I have this particular notebook where I write adventures and things that have happened to us, little diary pieces just for me. And I got it out on the first night of a holiday, and my husband said, oh, those should go in a book. And I said, yeah, they'll end up in a novel. And he said, no, put those in a book by themselves. And I said, no one wants to read my diaries. And it's just inconceivable. But then I started to quite like the idea. I started to think I could make these into something that people might want to read. And then other friends, when I mentioned it to them, sort of quite tentatively, and I expected them to fall about laughing, but they said, no, we'd love to read a book like that. And so my next newsletter, I explained that I was going to do this. And it somehow opened a much more personal way of writing about my everyday creative life and about things that inspired me. And I thought, this is the stuff I should be writing in my newsletter as well, to connect with people. Because it also seemed that whenever I explained to someone that I was going to do this, they immediately thought, oh yeah, we'd like that from you. And so I thought, I'll start writing my newsletters like that too. And thus it became a way for me to keep the connection going with people who had liked previous books or had come across me and thought, I'd like to just keep an eye on what she's doing in case there's a book that we like, or I read a book of hers, liked it, like to know if she does some more. But if you don't really have many books that you're putting out, if you don't have a big output, it's difficult for people to keep up with you. And suddenly this was a way for me to sort of keep the conversation going. If someone had liked my work, I could write them something that would remind them, oh yeah, we quite like the things she does. So that was the intent, to find a way to just keep on people's radar, and in a way that gave them something as well.
Well, I like two ideas in that. One is that I think many newsletters are focused on marketing a book, whereas the way you're describing the newsletter, it's almost more marketing the author. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I have another question, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on that first.
I think, yes, it sounds so self-centered, but it is about marketing the author. Because, again, the kind of books that I write, people like them because of my particular take on things. They like them because of what I've done with an idea, and that's about me. And if you took those same ideas that I started with, you would make something entirely different. That would be about what people like about you. So people do like an author's particular way of doing things. And so yes, that is the intent. It's also like what you like about columnists you enjoy. You just enjoy their take and their peculiar mind and all the little things they're interested in that no one else is interested in quite the same way. And so it all adds up to just a familiar thing that people enjoy.
Yeah, I think that idea of letting your personality shine through is so important, because I think, the newsletters I subscribe to, or the podcasts I listen to, or the content I absorb about indie publishing, honestly, there's not that much new. It's not like, every day I'm listening to a completely new take on an idea I've never heard of before. It's almost always somebody whose opinion I respect sharing their thoughts on something that's already out there, like selling direct or incorporating tropes in genre fiction. It's not new stuff. It's a new take that they're bringing to it. And to the extent that you can let that shine through in your newsletter, then that's all to the good.
Another thing I do in my newsletter is I've got a few elements to it. I usually start with one little personal story, and then I have news about what I'm actually working on, and those will be ongoing things. So it's this month I did more of this book and so on. I've also been working on a ghostwriting project with a musician or something like that. And then at the end, what I have is an ongoing story about me and my horse. And again, I wouldn't have thought that this would appeal to very many people because, not everybody likes horses. But it's actually about the relationship between me and the horse. And I found that people, even who aren't very horsey, just really like it. And sometimes they say to me, that's the bit I read first, because it's an ongoing story as well. So there's a few elements. There's ongoing story, and then there's story of the month.
And I thought a great formatting idea that you had is putting a little horse section at the end, because for those people who are saying, oh, I'm just opening it up because I want to find out what's happening with the horse, and they scroll down, they're likely to scroll past something. They're like, oh, wait, that looks interesting. Here's an article about an abandoned airfield. I'm going to go back and read that. So I thought even the positioning of that was well thought out, or serendipitously very effective.
Yeah, thank you. But I have actually discovered, since I arrived at this format, that it corresponds to a lot of very well established things that marketers tell us all the time. Ongoing story, getting people to just like your voice and your outlook, and all that is probably what a marketer would say. We've been telling people that for years.
Yeah, exactly.
But also for me, it arose naturally and organically. It became something that I could do and enjoy as a creative act, rather than just something I was thinking of as, oh, my marketing duty. I mean, marketing can be fun if you can find the ways to do it that are true to you. And in my case, telling a story or telling the ongoing story of something that's been going on for a long time, but also finding something like an abandoned airfield and thinking, right, how am I going to make this interesting to a lot of people? And again, that's a nice creative challenge too. So it took me a while to find the thing that would be right for me, but now I really enjoy doing them. And that also means I'm committed all the more.
Do you have some kind of general percentage that you're allocating in your newsletter to, the story you're telling, the story you're focusing on that one, the horse segment, and then updates on what you're doing? Like, are the updates on what you're currently doing in your creative life, how much of space are you taking up with that versus the other content you've described?
I just judge it on how much I reckon I can keep the reader's interest. And when I draft especially the story sections, they're often much longer. And then I go back and edit. And again, I think editing is one of the most creative things a writer could do. I absolutely love it, because you start with a splurge of something that contains something that is meaningful. And then you go back and you find the meaningful thing. And so I let each of those stories take as long as they need. But I do understand what you mean. You don't want one kind of content to overbalance the whole newsletter. So I do make sure that I don't make them too long. But as they're usually only making 1 or 2 points, they're not going to be very long. Probably a couple of 100 words, if that. And I put lots of pictures in too, so that it might not even be a couple of 100 words. But again, it depends what suits you. What suits your readers and what do you want them to be interested in? Because I'm aiming for people who enjoy getting a piece of text and falling into it and being taken along by words, not necessarily pictures or bullet points. It is about the words. And I think Substack is a good medium for that. If you're writing the kind of prose where you expect people to enjoy prose, some of the social media where the focus is more on quick points and pictures and people who don't have much attention and reading on tiny screens. For a long time, we've all been told to be very brief and to use pictures as much as possible. But what about the people who are looking for the people who enjoy reading words? So again, I don't worry too much if a story turns out a little bit long. If I feel I have kept the momentum and it deserves to be longer, I'll put it in.
Yeah, I think that anyone who goes through podcast episodes and searches for newsletter this will sound familiar to them, but I think that the format of newsletters, or maybe just the concept of newsletters, I don't know what it is, but as someone who does enjoy absorbing content, I totally hear what you're saying. As someone who subscribes to newsletters, I realize that my own preference is when I subscribe to a newsletter, it's because I'm looking for very specific kind of information and I want to get it effectively. I don't think of newsletters as something to immerse myself in. Whereas if I went to Substack, I would. And so I'm wondering if you have tips for people who could kind of get past that, expanding how you think about newsletters, and maybe also talk about the idea if you're also publishing on something like Substack, what are the limitations of having content on Substack and then also distributing it in the newsletter for people who don't want to go to Substack for that?
Well, I put my newsletter content on both Substack and MailChimp.
Okay.
It's the same content in both, but they're 2 avenues because
Right.
Substack is a place that some people just like that. They like that world of Substack. And there are ways to recommend other people, and I cross-recommend other people and all that. So that's sort of one universe you can publish in. And then what I put in MailChimp is exactly the same. And I don't think there's any problem with that. I wouldn't put my newsletter content also on my blog because I I remember hearing years ago that Google penalizes the content that turns up in more than one place. So I'm not sort of committing that sin of publishing the same thing in two places that's going to therefore mean I get downgraded by a search. Other kinds of legality, well, the content belongs to me. I can do whatever I like with it. So there's no worry about that. And I just reckoned when I discovered about Substack that it was worth giving it a try, that I would find more people who like the kind of people I want to reach. Because also when I read Substacks, I read the ones that are thoughtful and they've got something interesting to say, and it's about the quality of the writer's mind, rather than looking for information. I do get what you're saying, though, about reading newsletters for certain kinds of information. There are some of those I subscribe to too. And there, what I want is just what do I need to know to do this thing? But this is a different kind of reading.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking that I might even be able to get past some of my, this is a newsletter, I want to make it short and snappy mindset by writing what I want to write in something else, like writing it as a blog post, even if I never post it as a blog post, but writing it somewhere else, in a Word document, I don't know, just somewhere other than my newsletter template, because that might help me be a little more creative with the content I'm sharing.
But what have you got your newsletter readers used to? And have you got that going well? You don't want to fiddle with something that isn't broken. If you gave your newsletter readers a new kind of thing and they thought, but, we've come to rely on Matty to do this, and that's what we want, and that's what we enjoy when she does it. You don't want to break that.
Yeah, I have, a reasonably sized email list, and I don't get very many unsubscribes, so people aren't unhappy with what I'm sending out, but I have trained them to get, basically, I'm using it to alert people to author events, alerting them to book launches. And actually, just recently, I was accepted as part of a cross promo for thriller writers. It's 13 thriller writers, and the commitment is that each author features one of the other authors once a month. So it's a year-long cross promo, and once a month I'm being featured in another author's newsletter, and I'm featuring one in my newsletter. And that's something I'd resisted for a long time because I didn't necessarily have time to read 12 thrillers to present them as something that I had read in their entirety. But I thought this was a great opportunity. I thought I'd give it a go. And I did get readers saying, oh, this was cool. We enjoyed hearing about this other author. And the fact that they were genre appropriate, like by definition, they were going to be genre appropriate, helped. But it made me realize that the people who got in touch with me and said they enjoyed that were open to seeing something a little different than the very short, snappy, here's some upcoming events thing I had been doing.
Yes. And it's funny that you mentioned the cross promos, because I think that's very powerful. I don't take part in those so much because it's hard to find people who are really like me who want to do that kind of thing. But I do get a lot of my book recommendations from features that people write on things like Electric Literature, where they'll say 5 novels with unusual time travel, or there'll be some theme that they've picked out. And I think, I'll go and look at those. And I do look at them all and read them carefully. And I make a list of things that I want to read from that. And I think what you've got to figure out is where, if you want to reach more readers, where do your readers go to find the books they like and what works for them? And you've obviously hit on something with this promo, because you found people are coming to you, and then hopefully all the other thriller readers are going to be going to their authors and thinking, well, what else do they read? Because I want to read what they're reading.
Yeah. Well, I realized that another mental block I have about newsletters is that, with some exceptions, there's always a little group of recipients who write back and say, oh, I'm so glad to hear about this, or I'll try to be at your event or whatever. But oftentimes it's very much a one-way thing. The other place that I interact with people about reading recommendations is on Facebook. So once a week I post what are you reading? And I say what I'm reading, and then I get a lot of interaction with what other people are reading. And if it's something that I've read, then I'll comment, I'm interacting with them that way. And that's I'm much more likely to stick with that because I'm getting some feedback. Are there ways that you have, or you can recommend authors would create a somewhat more interactive environment with your newsletter? Do you solicit people to respond to you? And if you do, have you found things that work better or less better?
Well, I experimented with things like putting a question at the end of a piece I'd written, saying, has this ever happened to you, or something like that. And of course, the more unusual and strange the stories were that sometimes quite strange things happen to me, so I'll write about them. And I can't ask if that's happened to anyone else. But then I found it made no difference if I did ask people about whether things had happened to them. They write back anyway. If I do have, like you have, a few people who always write back and say something about the newsletter, and there's more and more of them each time. And it's funny, you only need a few of those, and you think, yes, it got out, it touched some minds and hearts. And then sometimes somebody will contact me and say, I've been reading this for years and I love this, or whatever. And you realize there are a lot more silent readers out there. But I also like the idea of the reading question that you pose every week, because that's really rewarding. I always go and answer them. I like seeing what other people are reading. I like saying, oh yeah, I'm reading this and I recommend it if you like this. And just the interaction is really rewarding. But there is something I do, which has just evolved again because I felt like it. On my Facebook author page, I put up a picture of my desk every Monday morning. Usually, if I've remembered in time, it's the setup screen with the time and the date and the light coming in through my study window. And I just say, hello, it's Monday. What are you up to? I'm doing this and this and this. And people love that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think that people love that behind the scenes glimpse of what authors are doing.
It also keeps up the idea that you are very much working, you are creating, you're still doing things. And when I meet friends and they say, so what are you working on? I might say, oh, well, there's this book about this or this and this. And so they want to check in that you're still doing something. And the desk picture has turned into it. I've got years and years worth of these now. I've been doing it for such a long time. But yeah, I really like doing that.
Something that I think readers are always interested in is the research authors are doing. And if you're like a thriller, mystery, or suspense author, then you can make funny jokes about like what the latest weird Google search you did was in an incognito window. But I think that any writer has these things that they're doing behind the scenes that it doesn't necessarily occur to them would be interesting to other people. And if through the course of the week you kept track of your Google searches or the books you checked out of the library or sites you went to research, the abandoned airfield or whatever you're writing about, that could be really interesting for people. I know that your newsletter about the abandoned airfield linked to some more information that was very interesting. And people love that. I think people love accompanying their favorite writers down the research rabbit holes or just the experiential rabbit holes.
Yes. And yeah, that is nice. I know I like it when I read other people's newsletters or blogs and just what they're doing. There's something I'm working on at the moment and I can't share what my research is. So then that becomes difficult. If you have spent a productive few days doing something that was fascinating and absolutely vital to your next creative project that you will eventually unleash, but you can't share what it is. But if you say that, then people will think you're just being coy and irritating. So I think you've got to give people something a bit solid that they can go after. What I do sometimes is I've got some evergreen pieces that I can put in if I can't share something about what I've actually been doing because it would give too much away and I can't give that away yet. But so I do have some evergreen pieces that I write when I've got the inspiration. I think, well, I can put that in if necessary and it's not time sensitive and it will be this month's adventure.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I've done on social media, and I guess there's no reason I couldn't generalize this to newsletters, and it would make it more interactive, is, oftentimes I'll be writing something and I need a name for the first name of a teenage boy who's working at a checkout at a Walmart. And I'll put that up on Facebook. And I have a private Facebook group, and I normally do it there, but I say, give me the name of a teenage boy who's working at checkout at Walmart. And then I'll get a bunch of comments and then I'll say, oh, I love Jane's idea. I'm going to, thanks Jane for that. And then that's fun because they get this sense of participation in the creative process. And then when they buy the book, they'll open it up and there's their name that they had suggested. And I might experiment with that because I'd be curious to see if I get any reaction, if I get as many reactions in a newsletter format as in social media format. I guess there's also a general message to people out there who are readers to say, the people who are writing the newsletters love to hear whether you like it or not. And
Yes,
you can make it a two-way conversation.
But I love the idea of asking that question and just getting people to contribute because writing can be quite lonely, and social media is our office space. So we can just put our head up and say to our colleagues or anyone else who's sitting around, "What do you call this? My mind's a blank." And that's rather fun to have that input. But I wanted to ask you, actually, you mentioned you've got a private Facebook group. What do you find are the advantages of having a private group as opposed to there are several kinds, aren't there? You can have just a group that isn't private, but talk me through that.
Well, the private part I did just because I didn't want to worry about the moderation considerations of making it a more open group. I feel like if people ask to join a group, fill out the 2 questions they have to answer, whatever, they're less likely to be bad actors. So that was one consideration.
Mm.
Early on, it was actually a podcast conversation I'd had with Jason Casper, who had a very active, has, I'm sure, still a very active private Facebook group. And I had joined his group. It was, obviously a great marketing outreach outlet for him. And so I kind of spun one up as an experiment for that. And I'm not super active on it right now, but I do believe that Facebook is more likely to show a post to a private group to a member than they are just your regular page sort of posts. And I have found that when I do post in there, and it's almost always to ask questions. So there's more incentive for people to respond, that it's a small but engaged group. And I really use it more like market research. I'll go on there and I'll say, where are you? What do you like to look for in newsletters? I mean, that would be a great question to ask in the private Facebook group, just because those people kind of by definition know my work and they're more likely to see the post. So those are a couple of the reasons that the way I use my private Facebook group.
That's really interesting, especially about the way the algorithm will show these posts to people. That's valuable information, isn't it? I was thinking I like the private groups that I'm a member of because I had to make a little commitment to join them. As you say, you're asked a few questions. You have to think, why do I want to join this? And that's making a commitment to think of your answer. Just a little one, but it is. And that means you might notice the first few posts and then you get used to that group. And it's, again, familiarity that, the place very quickly becomes a place you're comfortable in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a nice tie in there to newsletters, because even if there's not that kind of interaction, like certainly when one of your newsletter subscribers is never going to have an opportunity to interact with another of your newsletter subscribers, there's still, you're creating that world, you're setting an expectation, you're sending out the signals that will make it clear to people whether this is something that they want to engage in or not. Like, are they looking for the bullet points, or are they looking for more immersive content?
And what questions do you ask?
I think that I have a couple of, like, they have to have been a member of Facebook for more than a week or something like that. Because I guess there are people who just like spin up new accounts in order to spam groups. But I asked for the name of one, who's their favorite character in one of my series, other than, the title characters. And even if they said, "Oh, I just met you in this other Facebook group, I haven't read one yet, but I'm looking forward to getting to know them," that's fine. Like, that's a fine answer. But it does, like you're saying, it makes them think for a second. And I think just that little bit of thought makes for a better community, because they're making a little bit of an effort to join it.
Yes, and make them think for a second is, like I said, it makes them notice they've done it, because there's so much free stuff around, so much stuff we can just click on, forget we ever did, or just forget the interest that led us there. So yeah, I think that's really clever, actually.
Yeah. I also have a private nonfiction, so that's for my Matty Dalrymple presence on Facebook. I have the similar thing for the indie author, use it for similar kinds of things. Like, especially, I'll say, I'm really interested in talking to a podcast guest about this topic. Do you have any suggestions? That kinds of thing. Again, I'm kind of using it as market research. And it's interesting that I have never had any trouble figuring out what to put in my indie author newsletter, because it's very apparent. It's, what is this week's podcast episode about? Here's a discount code to a product or service that an indie author might be interested in. But yeah, the things that we're talking about are giving me lots of ideas for how I could feel more comfortable on the fiction side as well. Are you favoring driving people to your fiction or nonfiction platforms in your newsletter? Do you have separate ones?
Well, I was about to ask you if you had separate ones, because it's clear that
Yeah.
you do have a separate channel with the indie author and then your fiction. And I remember we were all taught in Indie Author Marketing 101 that you had to have your separate channel. And I tried that for quite a long time, because I began with a blog that was about writing advice. And I hadn't published any novels of my own. I'd been a ghostwriter and had published lots of novels as other people. But I hadn't published any of my own. And when I did, I thought, well, I'd better set up separate identities for that. And that got exhausting. And again, I found that actually it wasn't necessary to, because people came to the fiction because they trusted me, because they would come to trust. I knew what I was talking about when I blogged about writing craft and wrote writing craft books. And I began to think, it could just be one person instead of several identities. So in my newsletter and on my blog and on my Facebook author page and on my Substack, I'm just one creative person who does a number of things. And I know there are people who say that this can mess up things like the Amazon algorithm with the also boughts, but it's too late now for me to add an initial in the middle of my name for one of them. And I don't think it matters for me. It might matter for some other people, but it doesn't matter for me. And so I just do it all. And I don't actually find that I'm looking through my content and thinking, have I paid enough attention to the writing books this week or the fiction? I just post whatever arises naturally because there is something worth saying about it. And again, a problem that I used to have with newsletters before I found my groove with them was thinking I was having to manufacture things to say. And that's awkward. That's really, really embarrassing and awkward. And everyone can tell because it comes off the page. So I find it's better to just think, every book will get its turn, or every strand of my writing will get its turn when there is something worth saying. And then also that means that you're not sort of constantly telling people about your things when there's nothing new to say.
Yeah, I think that that makes total sense to me for what you're doing, because I think that you have one audience that is like the big pool of your audience is people who care about good writing. And that encompasses the people who want to read good writing and the people who want to write good writing. And so as long as your newsletter is illustrating that you yourself enjoy and can write good writing, then you're appealing to that big pool of audience. For me, I think I'm appealing to a pool of people who like to read suspense, thriller, and mystery, and people who want to publish their own work. So like the overlap is small. So I think it made sense for me to do that. But I think that looking at the content that you think of for each platform, like for me, I can look at what I put in my nonfiction platform, and I believe it makes sense. My recipients of my newsletter are confirming for me that it makes sense to them. And then if I started writing based on some of the tips that you shared, more content for my fiction writing, it would be really different. And so that to me is a good indicator that it makes sense for me to keep those separate, but it is not necessarily an overall rule that everybody should be separating things out that way.
Yeah, as you say, it's finding what works for you. We've got two quite different approaches here, and they both work.
Yeah.
So you can take whatever suits you. And something else I was going to say was earlier you said, did I have any more tips for what people could put in newsletters? Once you start looking, you find there's actually quite a lot you could share. The day-to-day things you didn't think were going to be worth talking about. They'd be too boring if you were trying to explain them to a friend, for instance. But if you say, I've just updated all the back matter in my books, writers know, oh yeah, that's a real trial. And readers, you can explain, this is a thing we do. Here we have to do this. It's all that stuff in the back. It's sort of not generated by a machine or anything, although maybe it could be date. It's generated by someone thinking, oh, is it up to date? I better make sure it is. Oh, here comes some long slog. And you can make a story out of that.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking that for people who are targeting a fiction platform, like I can imagine including some excerpts from my work in progress. and saying, like, here's a scene that I wrote. I'm trying to think of an actual example that took place in a diner in Lancaster County. I myself love going to diners in Lancaster County. Here, here's one. Here's some pictures I took. You know, I went on a research trip. I had breakfast there. Here's the meal I ordered or whatever. Those kinds of things. I think when people are getting little advanced glimpses of what you're working on, that's very exciting for them too. And you don't have to pick out the big, exciting, this is going to be a spoiler sort of thing. I think even the small bits, I have several scenes in one of my books that take place at a small GA airport, and so all the research I did into small GA airports would cue it up nicely. People would be reading that and saying, oh, that's really interesting information. I'd like to read a scene in a book that takes place there. And it's combining some fiction writing with marketing content for your newsletter.
Yes, I think that kind of content is always really interesting. And you can share just the things you noticed as you walked around. You won't necessarily be putting them in the book, but it's just how a writer's mind works.
Yes.
That's very interesting. People are interested in that.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah, I think that this has really helped me in that for many years, I've had a mental block about my fiction newsletter because I feel like I only have so many words in me per day. And do I want to be expending them on a newsletter? If I have time to sit down and write and focus my mental energy on that, then my preference is that I'm doing that for a book or an article that's going to get published. I'm looking at the business end result of what I'm putting those words down for. But the fact that there doesn't have to be that distinction, there doesn't have to be a distinction between the thoughts I'm having for my life in general that could provide fodder for a newsletter and the thoughts I'm having that I'm putting into a fiction book or nonfiction book is very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I find also the writing of the newsletter, although I do have to put aside a day or two and probably split into, say, half days here and there, but it does require proper concentrated work. But I found that has really smartened up the rest of my writing, especially because I'm taking something from real life and something that I've done, and I've got to make something out of it that is going to be worth someone else reading. And that is a fundamental skill, because as storytellers, what we're doing is directing a reader's attention and making them feel a very particular and exact way about something. And all that is worth practicing. And there are some people who do writing exercises to do this sort of thing, but we can actually do it and put it in our newsletter. And we have made ourselves slightly more supple writers as a result.
Well, I really like that because something that I had thought about doing in a past episode, I interviewed Rand Walker, who writes drabbles. I don't know if drabble is a word he made up or it's like a common word, but it's a story that's exactly 100 words long. And then just to make it even more impressive, Rand wrote a novel that was 100 word stories, each of which stood on their own, but also provided an arc across the entire length of that work. Like, holy Toledo. But I thought that I had put somewhere on a to-do list, I have a write one drabble a week as just a creative writing exercise. And that would be super fun to include. If you could commit to doing it, that would be super fun to include in a newsletter, to say every newsletter is going to include one 100-word story, and then extra credit if over the course of the newsletter, you're building on that. It's not like an isolated story each time. It's an ongoing story. I'm very excited about this now.
Yes. Yeah. And constraints like that can make us very creative indeed.
Yeah.
It's making me think of theatrical improv games where you'll be allowed to have conversations and that each person is allowed to say only 3 words. And the next person says 3 words. And you build up something from that, and it just arises out of nothing. In fact, the more tight the constraint is, the more surprised you are about what comes out. I think that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, and it would be cool. You could bake in that kind of aspect by saying, here's my 100-word story. If you have a word that you'd like me to use as a prompt for the next story, send it. And then that encourages some interaction between you and your newsletter subscribers. And then it makes them feel part of the creative process, just as we had been talking about before, which I think is always very fun for them.
Yes, and some people want to be part of the creative process. Some people don't. They just want to sit and read. I remember having conversations with people about interactive films when this was thought to be something that would happen. And I used to say, well, actually, I just want to be completely in the hands of the storyteller. And I want to guide me so perfectly to where they want to go. And I want to enjoy where they're going. So you will always get people who just want to enjoy where they're going, and you won't know they're there, but you will sort of because they haven't unsubscribed. You still have a list of quite a lot of people who are silently going where you're going.
Yeah. So cool. Well, Roz, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation and for being the person who may have actually inspired me to feel excited about my fiction newsletter after many,
Great.
many years.
Yeah, I'm so pleased.
So thank you for your insights, and please let everybody know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Okay, the easiest place is my website, which is rozmorris.org, and I'm Roz with a Z. So that's ROZMORRIS, and then put .org on the end, and you'll find me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Roz. I looked up the word drabble and found that it is, in fact, an official word. I've been pondering how best to incorporate it into my newsletter, and I thought that a theme based on the month would be appropriate. And further, that I will probably base them all in Ann Kinnear's world. In that case, I might eventually be able to expand them into a short story, or maybe even use them as inspiration for a novel. I also thought that it would be fun to engage my followers in determining the theme of the monthly story, probably on my Matty Dalrymple Readers Group private Facebook page, which you're welcome to join if you read my fiction, and I will keep you apprised of my progress on my monthly drabbles. How do you incorporate your creativity in your email newsletters? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from the episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.